Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Village Centenary by Miss Reed. To my surprise, I had a letter from the office about the skylight. Obviously, my pleas had touched some compassionate heart, and the gist of the reply was that this particular item, under minor works, would be treated as an emergency, and that Mr. Reginald Thorne of the Nook, Beech Green, had been instructed to call and examine the offending structure. "Should have thought the office could have found someone with a bit more up on top than old Reg," commented Mr. Willett when I imparted the good news. "Proper dog's dinner he'll make of it. I reckon I'd make a better job of it myself." I, too, had no doubts on that score, for Mr. Willett's handiwork, whether with seedlings, paintbrush, or bolts and screws, is always beautifully done. But the office had appointed Reg, and that was that. "When do you think he'll come?" Mr. Willett pushed back his cap to scratch his head. "Now that's asking. I know for a fact he's making a dresser for that new chap at Beech Green Post Office, and Mrs. Maughan is going up the wall about some shelving he promised her last autumn and hasn't never done yet." "He's like that, is he?" Mr. Willett pursed his mouth judicially. "Well, he's not a bad sort of chap, old Reg, but he's no flyer. I mean, he says he'll do something, and he means it, too, but his trouble is he can't say no to no one, so the work sort of piles up." "So you reckon it'll be summer before he gets round to our skylight?" "No, I'm not saying that. This being an office job like, and with forms and that to fill in, well, it might make old Reg get a move on. On the other hand, if all the people get a bit whacky and bully him, maybe he'll do their jobs to keep him happy. There's no telling." He raised his voice to a bull-like roar. "Get off that there coke, you young devils, or I'll tan the skin off your backsides, and you can tell your mums and dads why I done it." Mr. Willett's method of dealing with the young might not find favor with modern psychologists, but it clears the coke pile in record time. Whether Reg Thorne was awed by the county's official letter or simply wished for a change of job, thus evading his earlier customers who were breathing fire, no one will ever know. But the outcome was decidedly cheering for me. Reg Thorne arrived within the week, just as we were dishing out minced lamb, alleged, I suspected some man-made fiber, and mashed sweet. He was a tall, lantern-jawed fellow and said very little. He gazed up at the skylight with an expression of gloom. I had served all the children and dispatched the containers to the lobby to await Mrs. Pringle's ministrations before he spoke. "Rotted," he said. I agreed. He sighed heavily. "Still leaks?" "It's been doing it for nearly 100 years. "Ah, looks like it." He remained rooted to the spot, very much in the way of the children returning their plates, but I did not like to say so. At length he spoke again. "Best see outside, all right?" "Yes, indeed. Mr. Willett's ladder is by the wall if you want it." "Got me own. Insurance, see?" To my relief, he vanished, only to reappear framed in the skylight some minutes later. He appeared to be gouging pieces of wood from the window frame, and I only hoped that this operation would not add to the draft trouble. I served helpings of crimson jelly decorated with blobs of rather nasty artificial cream. It is the children's favorite sweet, and I was kept so busy scraping the tin for second helpings that I was quite startled to see Reg again at my elbow. "Needs a dormer," he shouted above the clatter. "Won't that be expensive?" "Yes." "Well, it's up to the people at the office," I shouted back. "You can only tell them what you think." "Ah," agreed Reg, and plodded off toward the door. "My mum," said Patrick conversationally, "said old Reg don't get nothing done in a month of Sundays." "That will do," I said witheringly. Privately, I feared that Patrick's mum was probably dead right. Time alone would tell. There is a widespread belief among town dwellers that remarkably little happens in the country. Any villager will tell you the amount of activity that goes on is quite exhausting. I'm not thinking of the agricultural pursuits by which most of us get our living, but of the social side of life. What with the Women's Institute, amateur dramatics, various regular church activities such as choir practice and arranging the flowers, cubs and brownies for the younger people, fetes, jumble sales, and whist drives, one could be out every night of the week if one so wished. As village schoolmistress, I try not to take on too much during term time, although I do my best to make amends in the holidays. But nevertheless, one has to face pressing requests for such things as 24 sausage rolls for the fur and feather whist drive or a raffle prize for the Cubs social. It was no surprise then when Mrs. Pringle approached me one morning and asked if I would do her a favor. This polite phrase, accompanied by a slight lessening of malevolence in her expression, was the prelude to my whipping up a sponge for some cause dear to her stony heart, I guessed. I was right, or nearly so. "I'm helpin' Mrs. Benson with cruelty to children," she announced. "Could you give us a bottle of something? It's a good cause, this cruelty to children." I wondered if a bottle of arsenic or even castor oil would be fitting in the circumstances. "Anything Mrs. Benson says, from whiskey to shampoo, or even homemade wine," she added. At that moment the children surged in a state of wild excitement. "It's snowing, miss!" they yelled fortissimo. In the stampede, Ernest stood heavily and painfully upon my foot. "I'll find you something," I promised Mrs. Pringle as I retired, wincing. And if ever anyone needs support for prevention of cruelty to teachers, I thought, nursing my wounds, I shall be in the forefront. Fortunately, the snow was not severe. One or two flurries during the afternoon soon died out, leaving the playground wet but not white, for which I was thankful. It was good to get home again by the fire on such a cheerless day. I was relishing a cup of tea and Tibby's welcome purrs when Mrs. Willett arrived. She is a neat, quiet little person, and renowned in Fairacre for her domestic efficiency. Mrs. Willett's sponge cakes and homemade jam invariably take prizes at our flower show, and if there were awards for laundry work and exquisite mending, she would doubtless take those too. She accepted a cup of tea after some demurring and sat rather primly on the edge of her chair. Tibby rubbed round her lisle-clad legs affectionately, and soon Mrs. Willett began to look more relaxed. "Has Mrs. Pringle asked for a bottle?" she said at last. "Yes, I can find her one quite easily." This sounded as though I had a cellar stuffed with strong drink, and as I knew that Mrs. Willett and her husband were staunch teetotalers, I wondered if she would disapprove. "Then I hardly like to ask you for anything more, Miss Reed, but the truth is I've taken on a bookstall at this bazaar of Mrs. Benson's, and I wondered if you could spare one." "You can have a dozen," I cried, "probably 24. I'll bring them down during the week." "Bob'll do that," Mrs. Willett assured me. "You put him in a sack and he'll hump 'em home all right." I was not too happy about my books, even rejected ones, ending up in a sack, but I said I would have a word with Mr. Willett when they were ready. "And what's happening about the Centenary?" asked Mrs. Willett. "Any plans?" "No firm ones," I prevaricated. "Do you remember much about the school when you were here?" "Quite a bit, though I started school in Caxley. We didn't move out to Fairacre until the end of the Great War, sometime in 1918. I had an auntie who lived in one of those cottages near the post office." "What brought you from Caxley?" "Lack of money," said Mrs. Willett sadly. "My dad was killed in the January in France, and Mum had 3 of us at home with her. Mum got a good job helping at the manor here, so we upped sticks and came to Fairacre." "A big change for you." "We liked it. Mr. Hope was the headmaster here then, and a good kind chap he was, although he was on the bottle then, poor soul, and that was the ruin of him. Fairacre was a lot different then, more shops and that. There was a smithy and 2 bakers, as well as a butcher and the stores. I used to have my dinner at the baker's sometimes." "Why was that?" "Well, once a week my mum and auntie had to stay all day at the manor. I believe auntie did a bit of dressmaking there, and Mum had to do the windows, something extra anyway. Most of the children took sandwiches to school, but there was a lot of horseplay among the big boys, and Mr. Hope didn't come over to stop 'em, as by rights he should have done. I was a bit scared, so Mum made an arrangement that I had 2 boiled eggs and bread and butter and a cake at Mr. Webster's on the day that she was up at the manor. What happened to the other 2 children? Oh, they were younger, not school age, and went with Mum and Auntie, so they had their dinner at the manor kitchen. Best meal of the week, Mum said. Always a cut off the joint, and vegetables from the kitchen garden, and a great fruit pie to follow. But I wasn't envious. I felt like a queen having my boiled eggs at the shop. With the baker's family? Oh, no, much better than that. There were 2 or 3 marble-top tables for customers. Not that anyone ever came in to eat while I was there, but the Websters did teas for these cyclists that were all about, and ramblers, as they were called, before they turned into hikers. Sometimes someone from the village would pop in for a loaf or a pennyworth of yeast, and then I'd feel very superior being waited on. My meal cost 6 pence, I remember, and I could choose any cake I liked from the window, after the eggs and bread and butter. And what did you choose? Always a donut. It was either that or a currant bun or a queen cake. I reckoned a donut was the best value. I had that with a glass of milk. Not bad for 6 pence. I agreed. Mrs. Willett's eyes became dreamy as she looked back almost 60 years. There was a lovely picture pinned up on the wall. I think it is an advertisement for Madawazi tea. There was this lady in a long skirt and a fur stole with a beautiful hat on top, with her Queen Alexandra fluffy fringe just showing. She was sitting on a park bench and dangling a little parcel with Madawazi written on it from one finger. She had on the most beautiful long suede gloves. I often wondered why she was sitting on a park bench in such gorgeous clothes. It might have dirtied them. Probably collapsed exhausted after carrying a quarter of tea, I suggested. She had a lovely face, went on Mrs. Willett. I thought I should like to look like that when I was grown up. But there, it never happened. She put down her cup and began to get up. How I do run on, but it's nice to talk of old times. Bob thinks it's a waste of time to hark back, but I enjoy it. That's why I hope you'll be able to think of something for the Centenary. We've got a lot to be thankful for in this village, and the school's the real center of it. It's good to hear you say so, I told her. Never fear, we'll do the thing in style, and I won't forget the books. I showed her out into the murky winter dusk and returned to my fire with much to think about. One day soon, I told myself, I must look through the school logbooks for some inspiration. But before I had a chance to do this, Miss Briggs put forward an idea of her own. What about dressing the children in the costume of the 1880s and making the schoolroom much as it was then? We could have copybooks with pothooks and hangers, and let them chant their tables, and even have a cane on the teacher's desk. I agreed that such a tableau vivant would no doubt appeal to the parents, but wondered if it might be rather ambitious. Why? Demanded Miss Briggs. Rigging out the children, for one thing. Plenty of parents could make the clothes for one, say, but I can't see big families like the Coggses even beginning. Mrs. Briggs began to look mutinous, and I hastily made amends. But I do like the idea, and will keep it in mind. After all, any brainwaves we have will probably need to be modified. We must remember, though, that space is limited, and if all the children are present, there won't be a lot of room for grown-ups. My assistant looked slightly less aggressive, and I began to wonder if this would be a good opportunity to discuss her too prompt departure after school. But I decided to postpone the task, as a bevy of infants swarmed in, bearing one of their number with a bleeding knee, all bawling as fiercely as the wounded one. It was not the time for a delicate matter of school discipline, but I determined to broach it before the week was out. Later that day, Miss Briggs approached me starry-eyed. "I've had another idea. Perhaps the vicar would dress up as the Reverend Stephen Anderson Williams. I see from the logbook that he was here for the first 10 years of the school's existence and seemed to pop in daily." I hardly liked to tell her, after throwing cold water on her earlier idea, that the reverend gentleman she had named was still remembered by the older generation as the man who had left a perfectly good wife and 6 young children at his vicarage to run off with a doe-eyed beauty from Beech Green. He was never seen again, but it was believed that he and his inamorata had made a home together in Belgium. Somehow I doubted if the present vicar would wish to portray him in our revels. The Reverend Stephen Anderson Williams would be better forgotten, in my opinion, especially as some of his descendants still lived in the Caxley area. "It's quite a thought," I said guardedly, and we left it at that. There was a sudden lull in the bleak weather, and for the best part of a week the sky was a pellucid blue, and the wind from the downs was warm and balmy. The catkins fluttered in the hedge, bulbs thrust their stubby noses through the soil, and the birds, bright in their courting finery, began looking for nesting places. We all felt 10 years younger, and the children were as happy as sandboys now that they could play outside. Even Mrs. Pringle looked a little less dour and sported a new flowered coverall. "Minnie gave it to me for Christmas," she said when I admired it. "I keeps it for best, but what with the sun and this nice bit of spring, I thought, why not wear it?" "Why not, indeed," I agreed. "Besides," she added, "what's the good of hoarding things? I mean, for all we know, we may be knocked down by a bus before he has a chance to use our good stuff." This sounded more like Mrs. Pringle to me. All was merry and bright, as someone sang lugubriously in the Arcadians, but at least she had shown herself momentarily in tune with the spring sunshine around her. One must be thankful for small mercies. I took advantage of this blessing of early warmth and ushered the children out for an afternoon walk. The rooks were wheeling about the high trees, and one or two little birds flew across our path, trailing dry grass and moss in their beaks, intent upon their nest building. There was even a bold bumblebee investigating the ivy on the churchyard wall, and someone said the frog spawn might be starting in the pond. Of course we had to go and see, but there was none there. I looked at my watch. It said almost 3:30, and we set off for the school at a brisk pace. There were several things to put away before Mrs. Pringle appeared, and grace to be sung before the end of school at 3:45. As we approached the school gate, Miss Briggs' little car appeared. The children scattered left and right, but I stood my ground. The church clock said 3:30 exactly, and so did my watch. Miss Briggs peered from the side window. "Can you spare a minute?" I said. She looked a little annoyed, but duly reversed into the playground. The children and I entered the school, tidied up, sang "Now the Day is Over," and wished each other good afternoon. Miss Briggs came into the room as the last of the footsteps died away. It was not quite 3:50. No time like the present, I thought, and invited her to sit down. "I oughtn't to stop," she said. "I'm picking up a friend at 4:00. This won't take a minute," I promised her, and began to point out the necessity of staying until all her children were accounted for at the end of the day. "But the hours are 9 till 3:30, she protested. "Not in teaching they aren't," I assured her. "The children are in your care. What would have happened if one had injured himself before I got back? There were 7 or 8 infants under 7 left to their own devices." She did not appear particularly contrite or even fully aware of having been at fault, but I made it clear that she must not leave until my children had collected their younger brothers and sisters, and she went off looking more irritated than chastened. Well, I had said my piece, I told myself, locking my desk drawers. Now it was up to my assistant to profit from it. And we'll follow the developments in the village next time.